Greetings, class. Just a word of caution. I do live on a farm, so please bear with any wildlife or farm animal noises you hear in the background. Today I want to talk to you about three sources, three articles that I found in the American History and Life. The first is by Alison Games. It's titled Violence on the Fringes, the Virginia and Amboyna Massacres. And what James is looking at is there's two massacres that happen within a year of each other. One is in Virginia. Hopefully we all know where that is. Virginia takes place in 1622. It is an attack by the Powhatan Indians led by Opechancanough. And if you're not familiar with this event, what happened was the colonists, there had been about 10 years of peace in Virginia between the Indians and the English. And the English colonists had really grown and spread out at this point. And then one day, out of the blue, Indians show up all over the colony with gifts of wild game and things like that. They were unarmed. They came in. The colonists invited them in, and they were eating breakfast together. And then on cue, all of the Indians started attacking the colonists. They just grabbed whatever they could to use as makeshift weapons, and they killed a third of the English colonists in Virginia. The other massacre she talks about takes place in the East Indies, the Amboyna Massacre of 1623. This one's much smaller. This is an example where the Dutch East India Company is suspicious of the English East India Company and some Japanese mercenaries, and they're suspicious that these Japanese mercenaries and these English East India Company employees are plotting to overthrow a Dutch trading port, and so they arrest, try, and execute 21 people. So obviously much smaller scale compared to the hundreds that died in Virginia. But what she does is she looks at both these massacres that take place on opposite ends of the globe. In both cases, the victims are English, and the English didn't necessarily provoke these massacres, but her thesis is that the English used these massacres to basically advance their agenda in both places, both in the East Indies and in Virginia. She refers to this as commercial and geopolitical prominence. This was their goal. Her sources are reports from officials in both regions, and her methodology is political. She's arguing that the English used the massacre to increase its land, power, and influence in both areas. Another article I want to talk to you about is by Wayne E. Lee. I've mentioned him before in here. This is a different article. This one's titled Fortify, Fight, or Flee, Tuscarora and Cherokee Defensive Warfare and Military Culture Adaptation. So he's examining two southeastern Indian groups, the Tuscaroras and the Cherokees. Both of these fought against the English in the 18th century. The Tuscaroras first, the Cherokees later. His thesis is that as these two groups learned more about European warfare, they adopted their defensive techniques. And so for the Tuscaroras, what he says is, as the Tuscaroras began fighting the English and fought them, they adopted a defensive posture of building forts and staying within forts. This was a failure because Native Americans had always, in the eastern woodlands, had always used forts and things like that, but their forts were designed to defend against small parties and to defend against arrows. And when the English show up with cannons and things like that, it doesn't really work. The English, even though this fort defense was Native American, it was also European. So the English already had a precedent, a historical tradition of fighting against people that were in walled cities or forts, sieges and things like that. So the English were successful against this. All right. Well, the Cherokee learned about this from the Tuscaroras and said, well, that's not going to work. So they adapted their tactics to basically running away from the English and then ambushing and attacking things like the supply lines. So rather than a straight out fight with the English, they tried to attack the English in small groups, cut off their supplies, things like that. And this was much more difficult for the English to deal with because this was a definite North American style of fighting. His sources are basically manuscripts from the colonial witnesses, primarily the militia and stuff like that, including the military journal of Colonel George Chicken, and this is a military methodology. All right, the third source I want to talk about is Ron Soodalter. It is titled Tidewater Ter 1622. This is also dealing with the massacre of 1622 in Virginia. He examines it and its aftermath. Mostly he's looking at the weapons and tactics of the 17th century Virginia militia. He explains some of the details of the massacre, and he discusses who was to blame for the massacre. And he's saying, well, the English blamed the colonists, the people actually in England blamed the colonists and said that, they were too complacent, they weren't vigilant enough and things like that. But Soodalter sort of excuses that. He says, no, by this point they were so spread out. The colonies were growing. It wasn't like the founding of Jamestown where everybody was together inside of a wall. People had spread out on the frontier, and there was no really possible way to secure it. And so his argument is that what actually leads to defeating the Powhatans is not any weapons or tactics or anything like that, but it's basically they just outlast the Powhatans. The English are having children and they're coming over in boats. The Powhatans can only basically resupply their numbers by having babies, where the English are having babies and they're coming over in boats. And so, over 40 years, eventually the English just overwhelmed the Powhatans with numbers. And this massacre, as deadly as it was, the fact that the English didn't go away after the massacre shows that they were there to stay. His sources are mostly reports and correspondences from Virginia, and his methodology is also a military methodology. Thank you.